There's a couple squeeze points where local government agencies have the ability to impose conditions on the development of land. This is pretty typical across the United States, but definitely applies where I'm at here in California. Those two squeeze points, you could call them leverage points. The two squeeze points are at the time of subdivision approval and when you go in to pull a building permit. So that's basically the two primary points in the timeline of a project, a land development project, when the public agency has some leverage and can squeeze the landowner for some concessions. And I don't want to make that take on too negative of a connotation. There's some very smart things that we do, like making people build to to building code standards. And in California, we have issues with seismic safety, and with floods and fires, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So it's not a bad thing necessarily. It can get carried too far, and we do that frequently in California. But the government does have a productive role in making sure that building construction and site development meet some minimum standards. And so the two primary ways that gets enforced in California is when you go in to either get in a subdivision approved or pull a building permit. I guess the other thing that could come into play if you weren't doing a subdivision, but you needed to get some kind of conditional use permit. That would be the other squeeze point. So what I want to talk about today is we're not going to worry about the squeeze point that has to relate to land subdivisions or use permits, but I want to talk today about what can happen when you go in to pull a building permit. And this also comes up, I guess another potential squeeze point that's come up recently is in some jurisdictions now in California, before you can sell a property, there are certain requirements that have to be met. And there's always been requirements. They're usually imposed by the lender. But in this case, these are requirements that are being imposed at the local government level before you can sell a home or any kind of property. So I want to talk about what could potentially happen at those squeeze points, the building permit squeeze point, and the squeeze point that happens when a local agency is going to potentially stop the sale of a property. And I want to talk about two hazards that we deal with in Central California specifically, and that's wildfires and floods. Now, there's lots of other places that deal with one of those problems, and there are a few places like Central California that deal with both. But we have major issues with both types of hazards. We're probably one of the worst places in the United States for both of those hazards. So we have some of the worst wildfire country, and we have some of the worst flooding in a very, fairly compact geographic area. So the way these squeeze points basically work is when you get to the squeeze point, you need some kind of agency approval, and the agency is going to impose some conditions. And I want to talk about the kind of conditions that get imposed that are related to these two risks that we talked about, these two hazards, wildfires and floods. So flooding is a major problem in the low-lying parts of the Central Valley. So everywhere in my town of Stockton, flooding is a problem almost everywhere, and up and down the valley. So if you're in Manteca, Lathrop, Tracy, Lodi, Stockton, Ripon, Modesto, Ceres, Salida, Los Banos, all the way up, Sacramento, Elk Grove, Roseville, flooding's a problem. So we got it's up and down the valley. Up and down the Central Valley, flooding is a problem. And then wildfire, major problem in the hills of the coastal range. And then, so that's basically like Oakland to Tracy, if you're traveling along that freeway band there, I think it's 580. And then, of course, anything in the Sierra Nevada foothills or Sierra Nevada mountains. So that would include Amador County, Calaveras County, Alpine County, Placer County, Nevada County, those counties up in the Sierra. Wildfire, huge problem there. And we've had a couple of our Sierra counties start to impose some conditions before you can sell your home. You have to meet some fire safety conditions, which I think is a good thing. And then, of course, we get some flooding problems along the low-lying coastal areas of the bay. So the bay is if you've never been to the Bay Area, it's fairly rugged. So they've got some hills, they've got some tall hills and small mountains. But there's also a lot of low-lying areas right along the coast that experience flooding. So why does this matter? Why is it becoming more important, these two hazards, wildfires and floods, and how does that relate to you if you're a real estate investor or a land developer and you're evaluating a potential project or you're trying to get a project built? Well, climate change is one of the factors, and I don't want in this. I'm not taking a position on climate change. I don't want to get into an actual intellectual debate. The reality is, whether you believe that the climate is warming and whether you believe it's human caused or not, the reality is most local government agencies in California believe that climate change is a real thing, and that is shaping policy. And it's shaping land use policy in a big way, and it's going to continue to shape land use policy in a big way. So we just passed some standards here in California that are going to require a bunch of clean energy, buildings to be 100% clean energy, I think by 2050 or something. So it's a big deal, and it's shaping policy. And without a doubt, our wildfire problem has been getting worse, and it seems like the flooding problem may also be getting worse. And so because there's more awareness around climate change, potential climate change, there's more awareness around floods and fires, which both get worse as the climate warms, both floods and fires get worse. So local agencies are taking a more aggressive stand about enforcing restrictions on potential development projects related to fires and floods. And you may not be able to pull your building permit, or you may not be able to sell your property if you haven't met new, more restrictive standards that relate to flooding and wildfires. So I'll just give you a couple examples. You might not be able to pull a building permit in San Joaquin County if you can't prove to the county that your new structure is going to be out of the base flood elevation. That's something we run into pretty typically. A huge part of our county is in a floodplain. So you just can't build. If you can't prove to the county that you're outside the floodplain, you can't build. So that's one example of that. And then we talked about the other example now in some of our foothill counties. I haven't seen this in the Bay Area yet, but in some of our foothill counties, you can't sell your home unless you meet requirements for fire-resistant materials, access to and from the property, and defensible space. So you got a wood shingle roof on that Airbnb cabin up in the Sierra off Highway 4, you might not be able to sell it till you replace a roof. And so there could potentially be some significant costs to these restrictions that are going to be imposed. So what does this mean for you if you develop land or you invest in real estate in Central California? Well, there's some really important things I want you to take away. So here's the first one. Number one, undiscovered flood or fire risk can kill your project or seriously damage the value of your investment. So what do I mean by undiscovered risk? What I mean is, if you purchase a property and you don't fully understand the flood risk or the fire risk, you could really get burned. Excuse that pun. Excuse me. The allergies bother me a little bit. You have to understand flood and fire risk on a particular property if you're dealing in real estate in Central California. If you do not do that, you are asking to get burned. You are going to get into trouble. So what that means is, as part of your due diligence process, you need to be evaluating flood risk and fire risk, and not just the not just what the government says your risk is, but your actual risk. More and more people are going to start to look at what's the actual risk. We just had a thing came out in the news. There was some folks, I think some academic folks that came out and basically provided an alternative to FEMA's flood maps, and they've got way more people at risk of floods than FEMA does. And I haven't looked at the maps yet. I'm going to. There's a lot of debate about whether or not they're good maps. But the point is, people are starting to care about what the real risk is, not just what the government might say the risk is. So you need to do the right due diligence. You need to figure out what your fire risk and your flood risk is on a particular piece of property. I'll give you a couple quick examples that will help you to understand that this is a real thing that we deal with here in Central California. So I had some hillside homes in the Bay Area. It was about 50 parcels, 50 homes, nice homes, most of them custom homes, very affluent neighborhood. And they're all on this really narrow, winding access road, one way in and out. Couldn't get a fire truck in and out if you wanted to. Road's too narrow. And there was some discussion among the neighbors because there's a lot of they've got a 50-foot road right away, but there's a lot of encroachments in the right of way. So fences, flower beds, patios, sheds, you name it in that 50-foot right of way, because the actual road's real narrow. It's only about 12 or 15 feet wide, the paved surface of the road. And so there was some debate and some questions we were asked about, are those encroachments important? Can we leave them in? And here's what I basically told the attorneys that were advising some of those folks. I said, look, at some point you got to pull those encroachments out of that 50-foot right of way, because your road's substandard, and if there's a fire right now, those homes burn down. That's the bottom line. Very expensive homes. They're going to burn down, and they're in a very high-risk fire area. Steep terrain, wooded, very dry. I said, you got to pull those encroachments out at some point, because at some point, either an insurance company, a lender, or a government agency is going to go in and tell those folks, your little 12-foot road ain't cutting it. And they're going to have to put in a road. They're going to have to put in a 25-foot road that meets current fire code. They're going to have to do turnarounds. They're going to have to fix the drainage, and they're going to need all of that 50-foot right of way. So I said, look, you don't have to do it today, but at some point you're going to do it. And those folks, this is my prediction, those folks will get to the point where they will not be able to sell a home in those neighborhoods until they fix the road, because they've got a major fire hazard problem. And they may be forced to put in a second alternative route in and out of the neighborhood, which they don't have. Right now they got one way in, one way out. That's how people die. And that's one example. I see this all over. I can't even count on two hands all of the custom homes I find built in the foothills of the Bay Area on substandard fire roads. It's a huge problem. It's going to have to get fixed at some point. And maybe some homes are going to have to burn down before it gets fixed. But before you invest in one of those properties, you need to understand what that fire risk is. I'll give you one other quick example. This is, I don't know, it's maybe 10 years ago, 10 years ago. We had a home burned down in Stockton, burned to the ground. It was an accident, fire, burned this house to the ground. It was in a relatively poor neighborhood. I worked for the local reclamation district that maintained the levee system. And they were in an unnumbered A zone. What that means is there was no base flood elevation established for the flood zone. So we didn't know how high the water would get. And the lady went to get a building permit to rebuild her house. And the city told her, we can't give you a building permit. She said, why not? They said, because we don't know where the base flood elevation is. And even if we were going to let you build, you'd have to build above the base flood elevation and put your house on stilts. And we can't even tell you where that's at. So you can't build. So now we got a lady, house burned down. She probably got a payment on that property. She can't live in it. And she can't build because the city won't give her a permit. And we ended up getting that fixed, but it was a nightmare and it took months. So you got to think about that. You might buy a piece of vacant piece of property, think you're going to build. You go down, find out you're in an unnumbered A zone. City tells you we're not going to pull you a building permit, and you may not ever be able to pull a building permit, or it might be years. We got to do a flood study and all this other jazz. Come up with a BFE. You could be hosed potentially. And there's going to be some agencies that just aren't going to let you build in flood zones. They just won't. So those are just a couple examples. So you have to understand your wildfire risk and your flood risk before you purchase. Before you purchase, not after. Work with a land surveyor. Get that due diligence done. Work with a land surveyor, a good private land planner that can assess flood and fire risk. They know how to read a flood map. They know how wildfire safety works. They understand, where local regulation is headed. The other thing is, conditions related to floods and fire change, flood maps change. Those restrictions are only headed one way in California. They're going to get more strict, not less. So you need to work with somebody that is educating themselves about those requirements and about the political climate, and that can help you understand the wildfire flood risk on a parcel. Do not buy land in Central California and not understand your wildfire risk and your flood risk.